Okay, I need you to stay with me here because what happened at 2:47 this afternoon on the floor of the United States Senate isn't just another procedural vote that gets forgotten by tomorrow morning. This is different. This is the kind of moment that quietly rewrites how power actually works in this country. 5 Republican senators just voted with Democrats to block emergency war funding for a military operation in Venezuela. Not a symbolic resolution, not a non-binding statement of concern, an actual appropriations block that stops money from flowing to the Department of Defense for an operation that, according to multiple sources, was already in its preliminary staging phase. If you're just finding this analysis, understand that what I'm about to walk you through is happening in real time, and the implications extend far beyond Venezuela, far beyond this administration, and far beyond what most coverage is currently explaining. Here's what we know. At approximately 11 a.m. Eastern, the Senate Armed Services Committee received a classified briefing from the Pentagon regarding what was described in public statements as force posture adjustments in the Caribbean theater. That's military language. It's deliberately vague, but senators who attended that briefing emerged visibly shaken. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, a Republican who rarely breaks with his party on defense matters, was seen in extended conversation with Senator Jack Reed, the Democratic chair of Armed Services. Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, a combat veteran and typically reliable administration ally, left the secure briefing room and went directly to Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's office. Within 3 hours, the Senate floor saw something that hasn't occurred in over 2 decades. A bipartisan coalition moved to invoke an emergency provision of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, specifically to freeze appropriations already authorized but not yet obligated for military operations. The vote was 52-47. 5 Republicans crossed over: Rounds, Ernst, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and in a genuinely surprising development, Todd Young of Indiana. Now, here's why this matters more than the headline suggests. This wasn't a vote against a future authorization. This was a vote to claw back money that had already been greenlit under existing emergency powers. That almost never happens. It requires a supermajority of the Appropriations Committee and explicit findings that the intended use of funds poses what the statute calls extraordinary risk to constitutional governance. That language is doing enormous work. Extraordinary risk to constitutional governance. That's not about policy disagreements. That's not about whether you think intervention in Venezuela is smart or stupid. That's a formal legislative determination that the executive branch is preparing to do something so dangerous that Congress needs to pull the emergency brake. And here's the detail that isn't getting enough attention. The vote wasn't scheduled. There was no advance notice, no press releases, no prepared statements. This was a floor action that moved from classified briefing to recorded vote in under 4 hours. That speed tells you everything about what those senators saw in that briefing room. Let me give you some context that explains why this is landing the way it is. For the last 6 weeks, the administration has been publicly escalating rhetoric about Venezuela. It started with economic sanctions, moved to asset seizures, then shifted to what were described as defensive military exercises near the Colombian border. 2 weeks ago, the president issued an emergency declaration under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, citing threats to U.S. energy infrastructure from Venezuelan government actions. That declaration unlocked standby appropriations, money that had been authorized by previous Congresses but never spent, sitting in accounts waiting for presidential activation. The administration moved $3.2 billion into operational accounts at the Pentagon without requiring a new congressional vote. Legally, they were allowed to do that. The emergency declaration provided the authority, but what senators learned this morning, according to sources familiar with the briefing, is that those funds were being used not for defensive posturing, not for readiness enhancements, but for what multiple officials described as kinetic preparation for regime change operations. Kinetic. That's another piece of careful military language. It means combat. It means bombs, troops, and casualties. And here's where the constitutional tension becomes acute. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing armed forces into hostilities. It limits unauthorized military action to 60 days unless Congress grants an extension. But over the last 5 decades, that law has been systematically eroded. Presidents of both parties have found workarounds. They've redefined what counts as hostilities. They've relied on authorizations for the use of military force that were passed decades ago for entirely different conflicts. What these 5 Republican senators did today was reassert a principle that Congress had quietly let atrophy. They said, we're not waiting for notification after the fact. We're not accepting creative legal interpretations. We're cutting off the money before the operation starts. Now, the administration is furious. Within an hour of the vote, the White House released a statement calling the Senate's action a dangerous abdication of leadership that emboldens our adversaries and undermines our national security posture. The Secretary of Defense declined to comment directly, but issued guidance to combatant commanders to review all operational timelines in light of evolving congressional restrictions. That's not spin. That's not political theater. That's the Pentagon acknowledging that an operation has been delayed or potentially canceled because funding was blocked. Let me tell you what we're hearing from inside the Republican conference right now. There is open warfare. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, one of the most hawkish members of the Senate, reportedly confronted Mike Rounds on the Senate floor, demanding to know why he voted to tie the president's hands while American adversaries watch. Rounds didn't back down. According to a staffer who was present, he told Cotton directly, "I took an oath to the Constitution, not to any president. What we were briefed on this morning crossed a line." That exchange is significant. Mike Rounds is not a maverick. He's not someone who enjoys being in the news for defying his party. He's a former governor, a pragmatic conservative, someone who typically works behind the scenes and avoids confrontation. For him to publicly break with the administration on a military funding vote means he saw something in that classified briefing that he couldn't reconcile with his understanding of lawful executive authority. And here's the structural problem the administration now faces. The 5 Republicans who voted to block funding are not the usual suspects. Collins and Murkowski, yes, they've been willing to cross party lines before, but Rounds, Ernst, and Young, these are senators who vote with their party leadership over 85% of the time. If the White House has lost them on war powers, it suggests the erosion of support is deeper than anyone realized. Now, let's talk about Venezuela itself for a moment, because the policy question matters, even if it's not the primary constitutional issue. Venezuela is in collapse. The Maduro regime has presided over economic devastation, humanitarian crisis, and political repression. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. Democratic norms have been systematically dismantled. From a U.S. strategic perspective, there are legitimate concerns. Venezuela's oil reserves are among the largest in the world. The country's instability creates refugee flows that affect Colombia, Brazil, and ultimately the United States. There are credible reports of Venezuelan cooperation with adversarial states, including Russia, China, and Iran. But here's the thing about military intervention. It doesn't end with the initial operation. It creates long-term commitments. It generates unintended consequences. And it rarely unfolds the way planners anticipate. The Iraq War was supposed to be a quick operation to remove a dictator and stabilize the region. 2 decades later, we're still grappling with the consequences. Libya was supposed to be a limited intervention to prevent civilian massacre. It collapsed into prolonged civil war. Afghanistan was supposed to be a targeted response to 9/11. It became the longest war in American history. These aren't just policy failures. They're examples of what happens when executive branch enthusiasm for military action isn't subjected to rigorous congressional scrutiny before it begins. And that's exactly what these 5 Republican senators are trying to prevent. Senator Joni Ernst, who served in Iraq, understands this better than most. She's seen what happens when military operations begin with optimistic assumptions and insufficient planning. She knows that once American forces are committed, the political pressure to support the troops makes it nearly impossible for Congress to reverse course. That's why she voted to block the funding now, before the operation starts, while Congress still has leverage. Here's what's happening behind the scenes that most people don't see. The Pentagon is not a monolith. There are deep divisions within the military leadership about the wisdom of this operation. According to sources, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff privately expressed reservations during National Security Council discussions. His concern wasn't about military feasibility. The U.S. military could certainly execute an operation in Venezuela if ordered to do so. His concern was about strategic objectives. What happens after the initial strikes? Who governs Venezuela if Maduro is removed? How long does the U.S. remain committed? What's the exit strategy? These are the questions that didn't have good answers in the planning documents. And when military leaders don't have good answers to those questions, they get nervous. But the White House, according to multiple sources, was committed to moving forward. The decision had been made. The operation had been designed. Assets were being moved into position. And then 5 Republican senators voted to cut off the money. Now, the administration has options. They could try to find alternative funding streams. They could attempt to redefine the operation in ways that don't trigger the same congressional restrictions. They could wait a few weeks and try the vote again, hoping political pressure changes the outcome. But here's the reality. Once Congress has formally asserted its authority on a matter of war and peace, it's very difficult for the executive branch to simply ignore that assertion without triggering a constitutional crisis. The administration could theoretically proceed anyway, arguing that the president's inherent Article 2 powers as commander-in-chief override congressional funding restrictions. But that argument has never been tested in quite this way. It would immediately trigger litigation, it would divide the Republican Party even further, and it would consume political capital the administration needs for other priorities. So the most likely outcome is that the operation gets delayed, redesigned, or quietly shelved. And that brings us to the deeper question underneath all of this. What does it mean when a president's own party starts blocking him on matters of war? Historically, war powers have been the area where Congress has been most deferential to the executive branch. There's a bipartisan tradition of rallying behind the president when American forces are engaged. Members of Congress worry about being seen as weak or unsupportive of troops. But that deference has costs. It means wars get started without genuine legislative debate. It means mistakes get compounded because no one wants to admit failure. It means the constitutional system of checks and balances doesn't function the way it was designed to function. What these 5 senators did today was break that pattern. They said, we're not deferring, we're not waiting, we're exercising our constitutional authority before the consequences become irreversible. And the political backlash has been immediate. Conservative media is calling them traitors, primary challengers are being recruited, donors are threatening to withhold support. But here's what's interesting. The polling on this issue is more complicated than the outrage would suggest. A recent survey found that 61% of Americans, including 52% of Republicans, believe Congress should have the authority to block military operations before they begin if those operations lack clear objectives and exit strategies. That's not an anti-military position. It's a demand for accountability. It's a recognition that sending Americans into combat without a clear plan is reckless, regardless of who the president is. So while these 5 senators are taking political heat right now, they may actually be more in tune with public sentiment than their critics realize. Now, let me tell you what to watch. Over the next 72 hours, the administration will try to reframe this vote as Congress undermining national security. Expect statements from cabinet officials. Expect friendly media coverage emphasizing the threats posed by Venezuela, but also watch whether more Republicans quietly signal support for what Rounds, Ernst, Collins, Murkowski, and Young did today. Watch whether the Senate Armed Services Committee schedules public hearings on Venezuela policy. Watch whether the classified briefing materials get partially declassified to allow for broader debate. And watch whether the administration continues moving military assets into position, despite the funding block. That would signal a direct challenge to congressional authority, and it would escalate this into a genuine constitutional confrontation. Here's the part that most coverage is missing entirely. This vote isn't really about Venezuela. Venezuela is the immediate trigger, but the underlying issue is much older and much larger. For decades, Congress has been ceding its war powers to the executive branch, not through formal amendments, but through practice, through habit, through political calculation. Every time Congress fails to assert its authority before a military operation begins, the precedent weakens. Every time a president expands the interpretation of existing authorizations to cover new conflicts, the constitutional boundary erodes. What we're witnessing today is an attempt to reverse that erosion. 5 senators looked at an operation that was about to launch and said, this requires congressional authorization and we're not giving it. That assertion, if it holds, doesn't just affect Venezuela. It affects every future military decision. It reestablishes a principle that Congress thought it had permanently lost. And that's why the stakes are so much higher than one vote on one appropriations measure. Now, there's a scenario that keeps me up at night, and I want to walk you through it carefully because it's plausible and terrifying. What if the administration proceeds anyway? What if they find a legal workaround or simply decide that the president's commander-in-chief authority supersedes congressional funding restrictions? If that happens, we're in uncharted constitutional territory. Congress would have to decide whether to escalate, potentially moving toward impeachment or contempt proceedings. The courts would be pulled into a separation of powers dispute that they've historically tried to avoid. And the military would be caught in the middle, following orders from a commander-in-chief, while Congress is asserting that those orders lack legal funding. That's not a hypothetical nightmare scenario. It's a genuine possibility based on how aggressively this administration has pushed executive power in other contexts. The 5 senators who voted to block funding understand this risk. They know they may have triggered a constitutional confrontation that spirals beyond their control. But they also concluded that allowing the operation to proceed without that confrontation would set an even more dangerous precedent. Sometimes the least bad option still carries enormous risk. Let me bring this back to the human level for a moment. Because all of these constitutional abstractions have real consequences for real people. If this operation had proceeded, American service members would have been deployed into a combat environment. Some of them would not have come home. Venezuelan civilians would have been caught in the crossfire. Regional instability would have intensified. And all of that would have happened without Congress formally debating whether the mission was necessary, whether the objectives were achievable, whether the risks were justified. The 5 senators who voted to block funding may have just saved lives. We'll never know for certain because the operation they stopped won't happen and the casualties that would have resulted won't be counted. But that's exactly the point of congressional oversight. It's supposed to prevent mistakes before they become irreversible. Now, here's what I'm hearing from Democratic leadership, and this is important. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has been very careful in his public statements. He's not gloating. He's not claiming victory. He's emphasizing bipartisan cooperation and institutional responsibility. That restraint is strategic. If Democrats turn this into a partisan weapon, if they use it to attack the administration politically, they risk losing the Republican votes they need to sustain this coalition. But if they keep the focus on process, on constitutional authority, on the principle that war requires congressional authorization, they create space for more Republicans to join them without feeling like they're betraying their party. Schumer understands that this moment is fragile. The coalition that formed today could dissolve tomorrow if the political incentives shift. So he's being very deliberate about keeping this framed as a matter of institutional responsibility rather than partisan conflict. And here's the counterintuitive reality. The 5 Republicans who crossed over today may have actually helped the administration in the long run. If this operation had proceeded and failed, if it had turned into a prolonged quagmire, if American casualties had mounted without clear progress, the political damage to the administration would have been catastrophic. By forcing a pause, by requiring a more deliberate process, these senators may have prevented a strategic disaster that would have defined this presidency. Of course, that's not how the administration sees it right now. Right now, they see betrayal. They see weakness. They see an embarrassing legislative defeat. But 6 months from now, if the absence of a Venezuela crisis allows the administration to focus on domestic priorities and economic policy, they might quietly recognize that this vote saved them from themselves. That's the paradox of institutional constraints. They feel restrictive in the moment, but they often prevent catastrophic mistakes that would have been far more damaging. Okay, let me tell you what the next 2 weeks look like. The Senate Armed Services Committee will hold closed hearings on Venezuela policy. Those hearings will be classified, but expect selective leaks as both sides try to shape the narrative. The administration will continue diplomatic and economic pressure on Venezuela, trying to demonstrate that non-military options are being pursued, but they'll also be looking for ways to reframe the military option in terms that might gain congressional support. Meanwhile, the 5 Republican senators who voted to block funding will face intense pressure from their caucus. Donors will be angry, primary challengers will start making noise. Conservative media will attack them relentlessly. The question is whether they hold firm or whether political pressure causes them to backtrack. And here's what makes this particularly tense. The Senate is narrowly divided. If even one of those 5 Republicans reverses position, the entire dynamic changes. So both sides will be working aggressively to either hold the coalition together or fracture it. This is retail politics at its most intense. Personal relationships, private assurances, threats and incentives operating behind closed doors. Here's the final thing I want you to understand. This story is being framed in media coverage as a vote on Venezuela, but that's not what it actually is. This is a vote about whether Congress still matters on questions of war and peace. It's a vote about whether the constitutional system of checks and balances functions when tested. It's a vote about whether elected representatives are willing to risk their careers to assert institutional authority. And the answer, as of 2:47 this afternoon, is yes. 5 senators were willing to take that risk. Whether that coalition holds, whether this moment represents a genuine turning point or just a temporary blip, will be determined over the next few weeks. But for now, for today, Congress reasserted its authority. And that hasn't happened in a very, very long time. Stay with this story. It's not over. It's just beginning.